Hello, you beautiful human. This is the 187 Said podcast, and I'm 187. The 187 Said podcast is a podcast for men, those who identify as men, and those that care for them. I'm producing this podcast to normalise the conversation around many of the topics that have an impact on men. If you're finding the episodes helpful, then feel free to support me by sharing the podcast, talking about the subject, or even getting in contact with me and letting me know what subjects I should cover. But also, if you have a lived experience that you think is important to talk about, or something you'd like to share, all of my contact details are in the show notes. This episode is about consent, and if there's anything that you want to throw into the mix, feel free to get in touch via the links in the show notes. So consent. So when I think about consent, I'm thinking initially, the first part of consent is the stepping over or agreeing the stepping over somebody's personal boundary or personal space. So for us to understand personal boundaries, we definitely need to remember some of the things I spoke about in previous episodes when I talked about our learning history. What we learn with things around us help us form beliefs, attitudes and opinions. Those create our kind of personal boundaries or the level of expectation about how we should be viewed or how what is and is not allowed. So we're talking about, yes, physical space. The person that comes to collect your rubbish will have a different access to your personal space as opposed to somebody who you're in close proximity to emotionally. So we've all got different levels of personal space or expectations for different people. But what I think is sometimes forgotten about is our digital space. I know there are different types of relationships, but from my point of view, I always found it quite weird when one person doesn't have a mobile phone because a couple are sharing a mobile phone or they're sharing an email address or they don't have anything individual. I always found that quite bizarre. Maybe I'm bizarre, I don't know. I also think it's quite weird that not that your partner knows your passcode, but will use it and use your phone and then go through your emails and say, who's this, what are you doing, blah, 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 that sort of thing. I find that strange. It's more indicative of somebody who's quite insecure, and that probably needs to be addressed more than ensuring that you have access all areas to somebody's life. I don't think that's healthy, but then I've been divorced twice, so it probably says more about me, but I find it weird and I probably wouldn't allow it. I don't have an expectation that I have access to all the passwords and everything in my partner's digital space. I would find it quite weird that there would be a reason to have, as I say, access all areas to everything, every thought. That's just me. And I'm now trailing off because I'm thinking, am I weird? Am I wrong? Am I causing a problem? Anyway, back on track. So we need to kind of respect, as far as I'm concerned, respect not only personal space, physical personal space, but also the digital spaces that people have. I know that when I've worked in domestic abuse settings, whether it's with perpetrators, some of the things they cite is that they become angry or upset because they've seen information on social media or on phones, or they've gone through phones and found something and acted upon it in an emotional way rather than just ending the relationship or talking about it. And then when I've spoken to victims of domestic abuse, there are things like being tracked or home devices being used to monitor them, apps installed onto phones without their knowledge. Hence why I think it's quite troubling if somebody has an entitlement or feels that they're entitled to have access to every part of your digital footprint. I also think it's strange that you would allow it. But then that's me. As I say, I've been divorced twice. What do I know? I could just be a horrible person. Anyway, that's the degree of personal and digital space I kind of want to look at. Stepping over those boundaries are problematic. As far as I'm concerned, for consent to be given, the person needs to be in a position to say yes, no, or maybe. The yes means yes, and the no means no. In order for you to understand what I've been rambling about, I'm going to play the audio for a video which I think encapsulates partly what consent is.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea, thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea, or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no thank you, then don't make them tea. At all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, "Yes, please. That's kind of you." And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, "Do you want tea?" Because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they're safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it going, "But you wanted tea last week." Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat going, "But you wanted tea last night." If you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.
When I watch this video, it makes me think about the person who is assuming that they have consent, that person's learning history, how they view the world, what they think they should and should not have, or how people should or should not behave. What's your view? That would be interesting. There are other things to consider. So if the relationship is an equal one, the yes to intimacy that changes into a no is not an issue. And that, as far as I'm concerned, will be when you are involved in a healthy relationship that doesn't have much in the way of issues of either party being unconfident to be able to say yes, no, or maybe to each other. Now, where that can become an issue can be in several areas. For example, age can also be an issue. So as much as a 42-year-old man having sex with a 19-year-old is legally okay, are there issues with this? What's your answer? Because your answer is going to be based on what your learning history is. So you might say, well, it's fine under the law. The 40-year-old will say, well, it's fine under the law. He'll get a pat on the back or whatever. But morally, is it an issue? For the individual, the teenager that is having sex with this person, what's their learning history? What's their view of themselves? What's their view of that relationship? What are their hopes and dreams of that relationship? What is it based on? Is it based on power and control? Chances are it's not based on equality. And what about when a 42-year-old woman is sleeping with a 19-year-old boy? Apparently, it's kudos for the 19-year-old. The woman is labelled a cougar. But apparently to the press or the world around us, no abuse has occurred. However, this is a 19-year-old boy, though. A few years ago was deemed a child. This woman is old enough to be a parent, as both the other example is the same. What's his belief of himself and the relationship? Now, even though that's legal, should either the man or the older man or the woman be in a job that brings about a level of responsibility, a police officer, a doctor, teacher, social worker, counsellor, and the reason why this relationship is taken place is because it's through that work, then even if the teenagers have agreed to have sex, apparently that is not okay because of the level of responsibility. So you can be a 42-year-old mechanic or 42-year-old dressmaker and have sex with a 19-year-old and there's no consequences. The moment you are in a position of authority, then there is an issue. But then shouldn't there be an issue anyway? And then in the basis of when an individual is paying for sex. So if you're engaged in employing the services of a sex worker, is that truly consensual? Yes, the person's agreed and there's been a transaction that's taken place. But are the circumstances of that liaison truly consensual? Is that person trafficked and held against their will? Are they part of an abusive relationship where they have been forced into sex work? And whether you know it or not, the fact is you're having sex with someone who is not giving consent. Another thing to consider is cognition, i.e., does that person have the emotional, mental capacity to say yes or no? So if you're being intimate with somebody with a learning difficulty or somebody who is under the influence of medication or has a physical condition where they're not able to say yes or no, or maybe, then being over the age of consent is definitely not even something to be considered. Under the law, it's still an issue. The type of relationship, the age, the context in which the relationship is taking place has a lot to do with consent being given freely. And again, this is outside of the over 16, so it's fine way of thinking. And in fact, many men have said, well, gave consent and is over the age of 16, so it's not like I'm a pedo or anything like that. It's not good enough as far as I'm concerned. Now, again, that's just my view. And yes, there probably are relationships that are open, true and honest that have where two individuals have such a wide age gap. But yeah, such a wide age gap. And they probably don't need the scrutiny of us looking at them and making judgments. However, I think it's only right that as individuals we ask ourselves, is that really consensual? And also look at ourselves. Why are we asking these questions? Is it more about us, or is it more about me that I'm even asking these questions than it is about the individuals or that relationship? And yes, there are laws around, sexual assault and rape and so on. But these groups are incredibly vulnerable to sexual assault and rape purely because of their cognition or their physical condition and so on. And also, it doesn't always have to be penetrative. The ideas around sexual assault or what is considered sexual assault is quite wide-ranging. I think I will hopefully do an episode around that, but I think because it's such an important thing to discuss, I need to make sure that I have experts and those with lived experiences really talking about it, rather than me just telling you what I know, what I think and feel about it. Sexuality is also an issue. So, same-sex relationships, the age of consent is 21. But again, when we talk about sexual assault and rape, if it happens when somebody's under the age of consent, do they necessarily tell someone about it? Certainly, from my experience of working with male victims of domestic abuse and or sexual assault, you're probably not likely, at the age of 17, you're probably not likely to go and report because of how you feel you might be viewed. Again, I don't know enough about the subject for me to talk about it, but essentially, not only is a person being put in a position where they can't say yes, no, or maybe, or offer up consent, but where consent has, or boundaries have been pushed, and that person has been assaulted, they're in a position where they can't report or they feel that they cannot report what's happened to them. And this happens purely because of them taking on board the perpetrator's view, or if you tell somebody this is what's going to happen. Again, we'll probably have an episode about that as a reason for us to look deeper than just 16 and 21 as the age for consent. We've listened to the cup of tea video, which shows us that just because consent has been given at any point, it should be able to be changed, leading us to understand that actually within an intimate relationship, or even an intimate liaison, as I like to call them, there still needs to be a level of respect and trust. So everything I've talked about so far has been quite general, but now I'm specifically talking about men and consent. So all of the things I've spoken about obviously applies to you, not just because you need to consider the other person when it comes to consent. They also need to consider you when it comes to consent. You also need to be in a position to say yes, no, or maybe. And I can't say this to men any louder than producing a podcast and hopefully hundreds of people listen to it and think, actually, hold on, I need to protect myself in the same way that women and girls are told to protect themselves. Consent also needs to be considered when it comes to procreation. So for men, you have to understand every pregnancy takes place because a woman has been impregnated. So at that point, this is the reason why you need to consider making sure that you need to take the appropriate measures to make sure that you have consent over procreation for yourself. The other individual can do whatever they want because it's their body, their choice, but also for you, your body, your choice. We've heard instances where men are having sex and they say that they don't like condoms and so on, and they've agreed to wear a condom and then they've decided actually at the very last minute to whip it off and go back in, and apparently that's something to laugh about. Bit rapey on my radar as far as I'm concerned. It's not cool, but I'm sure there are massive legal ramifications about it. But for men who are convinced or into believing that the individual that they're having sex with is using contraception, however, they have taken measures to make sure that the contraception is not as effective, i.e. not take it, say that they are, or say that they're taking the morning after pill, or Plan B, I think it's called in the US. They've taken steps to do that in order to make sure they've become pregnant. Or they have set up circumstances or chosen someone, I am going to have that person's baby, to make them stay. Again, that's down to the individual's choice for them to do that. As the person who's having to do the impregnation, you need to exercise enough control of what happens with your semen so that this doesn't happen. If it happens to you and you don't exercise the one bit of control that you have, there's not much I can do about that. But at the very beginning of all of that, in the very beginning of any intimate liaison, you will have the right to exercise, I am wearing a condom because I do not want to have STD, but secondly, I do not want to have a child. Of course, there are instances where you're in relationships and you might be coerced into having a child. That's relationship stuff, or where things are actively put in place to remove your consent and overstep your boundaries is not okay. In fact, I'll go so far as to say it's pretty much a bit of a shitty move. But I know people this has happened to. And when I say actively put things in place to make sure they become pregnant, and this goes as far as damaging condoms is one of them. But secondly, stealing semen. So for example, Dan that Drake has or is being sued by a model that he had consensual sex with. He went back to the bathroom and put, as per instructions on the wiki link that's in the show notes on how to dispose of a condom, he followed those steps and got back into bed. She then went into the bathroom and then decided to open the condom and try to impregnate herself. What she didn't know is that he's put hot sauce in the condom and now she's suing him. I don't know whether that's genius or shady, but the fact is she didn't get to use his semen. I don't know how to kind of view it, or how to feel, or really form my opinion about it, but that individual feels that she has a sense of entitlement to have access to his semen and to impregnate herself. And he had a feeling that he couldn't have that conversation to say yes, no, or maybe. So I would say that when you are having sex with someone, that you use condoms and you dispose of it in the way that you should do, but also probably think about the decision about where you lay your hat, to be honest. Just a quick recap. So we talked about personal boundaries, digital boundaries, and so on, and the circumstances or some of the contexts in which consent is not 100%, even if somebody says yes. So age, cognition, so learning difficulties, age, too young or too old, cognition, or physical disabilities could be an issue. Sexuality, the political climate, where you are in the world can also be an issue. And this goes for boys and men. Also, how somebody identifies themselves. Trans people are also at risk to sexual assault and so on, not being able to seek the support that they need. So as much as heterosexual men won't talk about or don't have protection in regards to showing that all sexual orientations or presentations are vulnerable to having their boundaries stepped over without the consent. So to close, what I'd like you all to do is, whenever you're having sex, use your own condoms, dispose of them yourself, always be in a position to say yes or no. And if you fear that that person is going to lose their mind, then perhaps you shouldn't be having sex with them. Hopefully you found that little chat or rant useful, gave you something to think about. I'm quite interested to hear from other men who have a reflection on what we've talked about. Yeah, and I'd very much like to talk to men who have been groomed as adults, or who has a lived experience of what we've discussed in regards to consent. You know how to get in contact with me. Just follow the links, the show notes, send a voice note, email, or direct message on any of the social media platforms. Okay, thank you very much. And remember, you are important. Thank you for listening to this episode. And wherever you listen to this podcast, please subscribe, like, or leave a comment.